Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about challenges toward achieving provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. This is an image of a dairy farm that's very common in the New York landscape. An overview of the talk, I'll talk about multiple ways in which agricultural systems are biophysically limited, land access, ecosystem dynamics, and energy use, so issues of the water cycle, nutrient cycling, soil erosion, pollution, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change, with the goals of how do we move towards sustainable agricultural systems. What does food security require, both from technological, social, economic perspective, which we're obviously not going to answer in this session. Multifunctional landscapes, and to me an important theme is the mismatch in timescale between soil and ecological processes compared to the rate at which humans can alter managed landscapes. Throughout this talk, I'll be using other people's graphics, and there are good information of how you can find the original sources throughout. To put this into an ecosystem services framework, right now, most agricultural landscapes in the industrial world focus on provisioning services. So we are focused on optimizing yield, whether it's for food, fiber, or fuel. We can envision a future where we choose to use some of our agricultural lands to promote supporting services and regulating services. And using this graphic from Sam et al., you can then envision a future in which the actual field itself benefits from those supporting and regulating services, improved soil fertility, water access, habitat for beneficial animals and insects. The issue of land availability, about 30% of the globe is land. Of that, 70% is habitable, and of that, 50% is already in agriculture. The majority of it is supporting livestock agriculture. About 23% is in row cropping. Those row crops provide over 80% of human caloric needs, but animal agriculture provides about 33% of protein needs, so it's an important component of agriculture, but there's flexibility in changing what we decide to grow to meet future food security needs. What does that look like spatially? Regions in South Asia that have higher populations are already at 70 to 80% land use towards agriculture. Big exporters like the US and Brazil are in the 40% range. In terms of temporal trends, over the long course of human recorded history, we very slowly added on agricultural lands to meet expanding population, and in the last half century, we've really brought lots of land into production. So, and predominantly, or one of the big sources are low population regions like Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand, but also really expanding into everywhere possible in places with populations as well. China, India, and the US have all expanded agricultural landscapes. So we're certainly land limited. We have to get smarter about how we use our land. Switching to biogeochemical cycling. Water use, this is an example from the US. Agriculture and energy are fairly equal in terms of water withdrawals in the US. However, water consumption is largely due to agriculture. So here in this case, averaging 85% of water consumption, and that's because when you distribute water on the landscape, it's susceptible to evaporation from the soil, evapotranspiration from the plant leaves, and so it's no longer available for use in the watershed by other life or for other human needs. What that looks like in the US context, in this area and in most of the eastern United States, grain-fed agriculture is rain-fed, and so the majority of the agricultural lands are not irrigated. Specialty crops are, so here we have a large apple production. If you own trees, you're not going to want to risk losing them, so you're certainly going to be keeping them irrigated when necessary, and also just to assure product quality, you'll need to irrigate. Same for vegetable production, even in this region, but it's a much lower amount of the time. In contrast, in California, where they're producing many acres of specialty crops, irrigation is necessary to support the yields that they're achieving. Other regions like the Great Plains are also very dependent on irrigation for grain agriculture, as is eastern Washington and Oregon, also for orchard crops there. So we use a lot of irrigation. The majority is from surface water, but groundwater withdrawals are also very significant. Again, in the Great Plains, this is a really huge issue because the Ogallala watershed is being drawn down faster than it's being recharged. So indicating that our choices for cropping systems in these regions is not based in reality of the precipitation regime there. And it's estimated that once that aquifer is drawn down, it'll take 6,000 years to recharge. So that's not a sustainable system. Sources of where we can change practices, a very small percentage of the landscape is in highly efficient technologies, and so especially in produce regions for high value crops, there are technologies for using much more efficient forms of irrigation. So we can move towards those kinds of systems, as well as help share technologies internationally for places where they would be appropriate. Every country has different stressors in relation to water use. So on average, 60% of water is used for agriculture. But in places like Asia, where agriculture is a large amount of the landscape, it's more like 80%, whereas in Europe, domestic water use is much larger. So every region will have to work on water use issues in different ways. But a really pressing challenge is that we're already at 1.4 billion people living in places where withdrawal is greater than recharge, so they're already water stressed. 50% of irrigation water is lost due to evaporation and evapotranspiration. And vegetable and fruit production often does require irrigation to achieve peak yield and peak quality. And even many grain regions currently require irrigation to achieve maximum yield. So opportunities for changing management, promoting more efficient irrigation, choosing cropping system rotation that's actually in line with the climate and the soils. And then there's definitely room to focus breeding on drought tolerance and climate change issues, which has not been a priority until recently. Turning your attention to nutrient management. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main nutrients added to agricultural systems to increase productivity. And they have slightly different issues related to improving management. Nitrogen is very abundant in the atmosphere, and once we figured out how to create nitrogen fertilizer, that has enabled us to drastically increase our yields. It is energy intensive input into agricultural systems, but it's nonetheless possible to do. Oversupply of nitrogen can be lost in multiple pathways. So nitrate leaching to watersheds, polluting aquatic systems, nitrous oxide loss to the atmosphere, and other forms of nitrogen causing air pollution. And there's economic incentive to over-apply nitrogen in the structure of the US economy. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is also necessary for plant growth, but it's in limited supply. Oversupply also causes aquatic pollution as eutrophication. There are large stocks of phosphorus trapped in dams and sediment that's trapped in dams. It has been historically over-applied in recent decades. What does this contamination look like? This is Lake Erie, which is west of here. It's a shallow Great Lake, and so it can't absorb all of the high concentration of nutrients that come in from the surrounding agricultural landscape. In past summers, the city of Toledo has had issues with its drinking water supply due to algal blooms, making the water toxic for drinking as well as fisheries. In cases where the eutrophication is really extreme, you can get hypoxic zones where nothing can live. And that is perhaps the most common issue associated with agricultural pollution in the United States, which is our very large dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. which happens every summer. Last summer, it was almost 8,800 square miles, the largest measured, but it's been averaging 5,800 square miles since measurements began, and the target is 1,900 square miles as a goal for reduction, so we're very far off the target. And what does the landscape that generates this problem look like? These are examples of what the corn belt looks like. So this is an Illinois cornfield that's in bare fallow in the winter, so it spends many months, nothing growing on it. These soils were largely wetlands prior, so they're very, very, they're high in clay. They have high organic matter content because before we drained them, they had slow decomposition. And so they create these pockets of ponding, which helps lose nutrients both to the atmosphere or through the water table. And in addition to sort of the natural background issue, we also largely, just sort of the economic reality or the logistical reality of this landscape, most farmers are applying their fertilizer in the fall. And, everyone knows this is a bad idea, but this is what logistically is possible. And so nitrogen is sitting on that landscape, no plants for months and months and months. And then you have drainage channels which take the drainage water, eventually it enters the Mississippi and helps cause the dead zone. So with respect to phosphorus, it's a scarce nutrient. It's essential to all aspects of cell structure and energy. There is no substitute for it, and we can't manufacture it. It's very abundant in the Earth's crust, but it's not very available at the surface for extraction. There's a lot of uncertainty into what the actual reserves are. They're largely from commercial estimates, but various authors believe it will run out will become unextractable by 2100. And there's anticipated to be an increased need for phosphorus globally. Only the North American and European cropping systems have been applying phosphorus on a regular basis in recent decades, or at surplus in recent decades. And the phosphorus renewal cycle is on the order of geologic timescale, so 10 to 100 million years. And you can notice when supplies are dwindling, extraction becomes more difficult. We did see a recent price spike, also concurrent with energy prices changes. We've either passed peak extraction or are approaching it based on different authors. The largest reserves are in Morocco. China, US, South Africa, Jordan also have large reserves. So we need to seriously work towards improving recycling of phosphorus in our agricultural systems and from human systems. Really recycling organic matter. The next source is going to be dredging dams when we run out of organic sources. In contrast, nitrogen, again, it's responsible for all of the increased yields we've seen in the past half century, or much of the increased yields. It is readily manufactured. So, we have that technology as long as energy is available. We can also manage organic nitrogen sources, coupling livestock systems and using leguminous plants. Challenges are that biological forms of nitrogen are highly mobile, and so in inorganically fertilized systems, we currently lose about half of the fertilizer applied. The challenge with organic systems is that there is some nuance to managing them, and so there are going to be times when the availability of nitrogen is not perfectly timed with crop demand, and for certain crops that can result in much lower yields or lower quality. So we might we might need to think about breeding or choosing cropping systems that can help us ameliorate those issues. And in the U.S. context, the density of livestock makes it impossible to really efficiently use the manure they produce right now. So in this region, it's spread at excess just because you can't truck it to places that don't have a dairy farm next to them. It just doesn't make sense energetically. And you have to get rid of the waste somehow, so it can be over-applied closer to the cave operations. So techniques for reducing or for increasing nitrogen and phosphorus recycling, extending the vegetative cover, increases productivity of going into the ecosystem, increases soil organic matter in the soil. An active root zone really helps retain nutrients, improves the physical structure of the soil, allowing for better infiltration and water dynamics. Techniques for doing this, using cover crops is the first easiest technique, so for getting rid of those bare fallows, including legumes in the system that allows for biological fixation of nitrogen. We can move towards perennial rotations, which means a plant will live for multiple years, and then more complex cropping systems in which multiple species are living in the field at the same time and have different nutrient needs, so they can be taking up nitrogen and phosphorus as it's available. Working to reduce tillage so that we can reduce erosion. There are industrial solutions that are applied in some places in the Corn Belt, so trying to optimize the application of fertilizer and using fertilizers that slow the transformation of nitrogen to prevent losses. In terms of manure usage, we just need a different scale of the distribution of animals to make it really possible to efficiently use manure. So really, in some regions here in New York, there have been efforts to work on digestion of cow manure to produce methane, and then also combining that with greenhouse operations. So you can use the manure compost, you can use the organic matter there. So there are some ways of making these systems more efficient at the current livestock densities. Some work that we did is an example of what a cover cropping system can do. So this is a meta-analysis looking at experiments in the literature. The bars are the distribution of actual data points. The icons on the top demonstrate that non-legume cover crops, so removing the winter bare fallow, reduces nitrate leaching an average of 70%, and a leguminous system reduced it on average of 40%. And in terms of crop yield, the non-legume system on average had statistically the same yield. The legume system had close to an average 10% yield decline, but then if you separate out the legume biomass that was achieved in the different systems, in places that can achieve a good legume biomass, there was no yield difference. And so one way that you can implement this is a farmer can very easily tell how well their legume did before they plant the next crop, and so you can add nitrogen when you need it. So you can combine techniques. These are organic systems that don't add nitrogen, but moving towards a sustainable cropping system, we can add nitrogen when the legume doesn't provide a sufficient amount of nitrogen. And so switching to other aspects of maintaining soil health, reducing soil erosion. Erosion is happening from water, wind, and mechanical perturbation. So environmental controls are intense rainfall and wind, which we can't control. Farmer controls are reducing bare fallow, limiting tillage, which will so decreased aggregate stability increases losses, and farming on steep terrain has a drastic result towards erosion. So management changes are, again, extending vegetation cover, keeping crop residues, landscape diversification, and avoiding steep terrain. Examples of what this looks like, if you have no-till, the soil is able to absorb water, so the water infiltrates as the precipitation event occurs. When you have a lot of tillage and very poor soil structure, you have a lot of ponding and soil particles being lost as runoff occurs. And in terms of the numbers, conventional systems on the top row have a median loss of 1.5 millimeters per year of soil. And if you look at the bottom row, and that's the median is fairly high. The bottom row shows that soil production is 1/100 of a millimeter per year, so 2 orders of magnitude higher loss. Conservation agricultural techniques that reduce tillage get us a lot closer to our goals, so they're less than 1/10 of a millimeter loss. What does this look like in the U.S.? In the U.S., natural systems would be losing 21 meters per million a year. That's the natural soil erosion rate. Now if we look at cropping systems, they're averaging, they're on target to lose 600 meters per million a year. So again, it's at least an order of magnitude. Some of the higher color regions are 2 orders of magnitude. So these two types of techniques are converging on two orders of magnitude difference in conventional systems. And so we need to take soil erosion seriously, even though we've done a lot after the Dust Bowl, but there's still serious issues of erosion. So switching to energy use in agriculture, energy towards agricultural field scale production is a very, very small part, of 3 orders of magnitude lower than in terms of the total energy used in the U.S. Just for field management. You can see this is an average, certainly more complex rotation than is common in the U.S. This is a rotation in Northern Europe, and the second to the last line shows you the mean energy from nitrogen fertilization in the rotation, and it's almost half of the energy needed to make the system function. The next largest energy usage is in tractors. And so, again, compared to total energy use in other sectors, it's very small, but in terms of the system that we're used to, we still use energy for nitrogen production in most of the industrialized world. This is an example of how the organic systems, cropping system trials in Rodale, Pennsylvania, how they compare to the average conventional production in the United States. So the first 2 rows of corn and soybean are the Pennsylvania system. The third row is the U.S. Conventional average. So in the corn system, the organic system had a higher yield, higher labor requirements, much lower energy input because it doesn't use nitrogen fertilizer. And so the output in the grain, the kilocalories in the grain is 7.7 times higher than the energy that went in. In the system, the conventional also does better than the U.S. average. But in corn systems, there's a range of what can be achieved in terms of the energy you get out of the system. Soybeans, in this case, the organic system had a lower yield. The energy going in is much more similar because these systems produce biological nitrogen fixation, and so there's a much narrower range in terms of the energy out or energy in. So what's the potential for legumes given current breeds and varieties? So these are the observations from our meta-analysis. And climate zone 4 is a very cold region, so it would be places like Minnesota. And so given current varieties, we weren't seeing those legumes being able to get up to what is, the red line represents the energy in the average cornfield in Illinois, really, which is a very high application rate. But those systems aren't getting enough from legume biomass, but across other climate zones where we were seeing observations where legumes did fairly well and could provide a reasonable amount of the nitrogen requirement. The table there is an example of what energy inputs look like in a typical Illinois cornfield. So again, the majority of the energy being used is because of fertilizer production, which you don't need in the legume fertilized system. Other forms of farm management have a much lower energy requirement, so an entirely legume fertilized system would use half the energy of a typical system. So now changing attention to agricultural impact on greenhouse gases. So agriculture is responsible for more than half of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and that's largely due to nitrous oxide loss from the soil surface and methane loss through animal digestion, so enteric fermentation, and those are each about 40%.
How about water vapor?
Sorry?
How about water vapor?
So this is not my research, so I'm taking data from the CGIR. And what does, we know, so this is the same image of Illinois, bear fallows ponded in the winter. We know that different systems have different susceptibility to nitrous oxide losses. So this is some data that we're looking at to come up with better management of yield scale nitrous oxide fluxes. And so you can see as the percent clay increases, you get a much higher magnitude of nitrous oxide flux and also high variability. So we can target regions to improve nitrogen management on to reduce nitrous oxide losses. There's also a lot of choice to be made in terms of diet and what we grow. So this is a graphic that shows a kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of food, and lentils have very low footprint. In contrast, wheat has a very high footprint, again, mainly from methane production in the digestion of the animal. But there's also other animal choices. Animal proteins have a much lower signature, so we can create a food system with balanced sources of protein that has a much lower greenhouse gas signal. The USDA has their 2011 publication has a number of points of concern for climate change impacts on agriculture, vulnerability of livestock to temperature stress. They're projecting that over the next 25 years, there'll be increasingly negative effects from climate change. Current stressors get exacerbated: weeds, pests, disease, multiple stressors occurring at once. So all of those, pest disease, including temperature extremes, precipitation extremes, higher frequency of weather fluctuation extremes. And so they're projecting that we will need adaptation to maintain the yields that we're capable of now, focusing more on regionally specific cropping systems and breeding specifically to handle climate change issues. In terms of smallholder farmer training, Eco-Agricultural Partners has a climate change module, and there are some repeating techniques that kind of converge from multiple approaches to sustainable agriculture. They're trying to help communities understand how climate change will affect their system, working on soil nutrient management, organic matter management, tillage issues, soil, water and water management, providing irrigation, reducing erosion, helping with infiltration, working on agronomic practices. So what will rotations look like, helping with training on cover crops, intercropping, different crop varieties that are going to make sense in particular regions, working on integrated pest management techniques that can help with issues of pests, promoting agroforestry in order to help people diversify income and fuel wood access, as well as nutritional supplements and medicinal plants. Microclimate also changes with the use of agroforestry, so you can reduce heat stress and water stress, provide windbreaks, and then helping communities include livestock in their cropping systems. Basic principles of conservation agriculture can help provide a framework for improving agricultural management. And so the fundamental principles are to reduce soil disturbance, promote permanent soil cover, really work on nuanced rotations to help deal with a lot of the pest, disease, and weed issues, but also be envisioning flexibility so that we can appreciate that regions have their own, vary in their natural ecosystems, vary in soils and climates, so we can't think of the one management practice works everywhere. What do some of these techniques look like in the landscape? So you can interseed clover into winter wheat, and so once you harvest the wheat, the clover immediately starts growing, and so that's a way to keep permanent cover on the landscape. You can use rye cover crop instead of bare fallow, and so in the spring, the landscape will have a lot of biomass. In contrast, you could have bare fallows in the spring, which is the lower image, which is more susceptible to loss of nutrients in the soil. And when you're in systems that have applied some of these organic techniques, there's a huge difference in soil quality. So the darker soil on your right is, I think it's been an organic system for 10 years at this point. and it has a lot higher root density, a lot of better soil structure. It will allow for infiltration of water as well as just maintaining a healthy soil biology. So in summary, we need to use our available agricultural land much more effectively and think about maintaining ecosystem services. So we need to build efficient water use, think about systems that are more efficient with nutrients, especially phosphorus. Think about cropping systems that work for the local ecology and really communicate this mismatch in timescales between soil processes and human land management. Food security has many components, so it's too complex to figure this all out in a short talk. Technical aspects are a very small part of that. There's a lot of social and economic components to food security. Food distribution is one of them. We currently have this very yield-centric vision of how to manage the land. How do we move towards diverse ecosystem services? We do have flexibility to change our food system in terms of the distribution of agricultural lands in livestock and cropping systems. But multifunctional landscapes can both promote ecosystem services that benefits the land itself, but also provide farmer communities with access to nutritionally diverse food, to water that is drinkable. And it's really important when we think in the global context to think about how people will have access to nutritionally diverse diets. So payment for ecosystem services has been one framework towards achieving this. I am not an economist, so yeah, I'm trained as an ecosystem scientist. I didn't mention that initially. I don't know what other alternatives are out there, but I'd like to thank you for your attention and sort of some thoughts about how to work. If the audience has thoughts for other economic frameworks that help us get to landscapes that provide more of what we need. So thank you for your attention.